Welcome to this episode of Timotheus Academy. This episode is part 3 of a multi-part Timotheus Academy episode featuring some of the elements of a discussion I had with Dr. Richard Howe. I hope you will be able to go back and listen to part 1 of this Timotheus Academy episode, and also go back and listen to part 2 of this episode. During my discussion with Dr. Richard Howe, we discussed different topics, some of which are featured here in part 3 of this Timotheus Academy episode. It is my hope that this episode brings great value to you. As you might expect, the content of this episode begins in the midst of my discussion with Dr. Richard Howe.
Well, and I hope you don't mind me sharing this. If you do, just let me know. We'll cut it out or something.
Please do.
Yeah, please cut it out already.
Yeah, please cut it out.
But we won't mention any names or anything. But I still remember when you were in. It was a kind of an informal debate, and you made what I think was a philosophical point, and one of the other people debating disagreed with it, and then went on to make the exact point you had made, and then you just remarked that was the point I just made that he had just disagreed with, and then his response to you was that you don't have a monopoly on truth. So after he said you were wrong, he made the same point.
I vaguely remember that. So when we're off the air, I want you to remind me.
Right.
I vaguely remember that.
The overall
that
point
part about that you don't have a monopoly on truth.
Right.
It's like, no, I wasn't saying I did.
That's kind of how a lot of these discussions tend to go when we're talking to people.
Yeah,
but,
it is.
But going back to, if we can, the Galileo controversy.
Yes, please. No, anything.
Again, you made the point, and I think this is so powerful. It's not as if the church was just standing against progress. The secular universities disagreed with the heliocentric model that Copernicus put forth as well. So it wasn't like it was just the church was just folding its arms and saying, we refuse to, have this dialogue. The other thing, and I want to say that you were the one that made this point at some point, is given the fact that yes, our Earth is in the solar system and we are rotating around, or orbiting rather, of course, the sun in the way that we do. But however, the sun is itself in motion, and the galaxy is itself in motion as well in the universe. And so we're moving several different directions at extremely rapid speeds. But there was some sense that there was some sort of orbit mechanism that the sun did have to be acted upon by God in order for everything else, for the sun just to remain in the sky in that way. Was it you that had made that point?
I don't remember that explicitly, but I will say this, and then maybe we can hook you back up to what you were thinking there and who that might have been, was when Bellarmine made his argument about the fact that the sun has to be moving. It's obvious it does, and Joshua 10, and the earth is still, the Psalms say, and those things. When he made that argument, and so therefore the geocentric model is the prevailing, is the right view. Galileo wrote a letter to the Duchess Christina, who he already had reason to believe she was somewhat sympathetically disposed towards Galileo. So he took a chance to try to appeal to some political clout, and explains to her that neither model, the heliocentric and the geocentric model, neither model can account for some of the things we observe about the universe. Some of the things that we think we know from Joshua chapter 10. Right. Galileo goes on to show, but your model can't explain that either, because if the sun was moving, okay, as Bellarmine thought, and then the command from God was to make it stand still, Joshua in it stand still. Galileo shows that even on Bellarmine's model from Ptolemy, that would have made the day shorter, not longer.
Okay.
It would have gone down sooner because of other motions that were going on rather than just because the sun is nested in a sphere. And
Right.
one of the spheres is the sphere that would cause the day and night, right?
Right.
So in that sphere, it's not moving relative to the sphere that it's in, right? The sphere is moving, and so it's stuck in that, so to speak. Except that the model also says that the sun is moving in a sense retrograde from the sphere in a certain way, and that's what causes the seasons. So imagine if the sphere is moving and the sun is hooked up to the sphere, and then but it's actually moving retrograde, which means it'll eventually set at the end of the day. But if that retrograde motion stood still, then it would have gone down quicker.
Wow. Yeah.
This is what, as I understand, this is what Galileo argues in his letter to Christina. It's like, okay, so everybody has a problem explaining what happens in Joshua chapter 10. It's not just
Right.
Copernicus.
I can't recall who specifically, but it was somewhere that I encountered that information. Of course, the Earth is spinning on its axis, so that's one range of motion, and then it's orbiting the sun, which is another range. But then the sun itself is moving very quickly as these planets just are pulled along with it.
Yes, pulled along with it.
And then even the Milky Way is itself moving at an extreme speed.
Yeah.
So, what does it mean for the Earth to stand still or the sun to stand still?
Yeah, right.
It becomes a very...
It's oversimplified. There's a lot of standing stills versus motion questions to settle. Well, whoever that was that you heard that from, he doesn't have a monopoly on the truth. So whoever that was.
That's right. He doesn't have a monopoly on truth. But, we've talked about, a huge amount. And I've heard your brother speak about this, who I just think the world of, in addition to you. But this matter of Tertullian in his work, when he asks this question, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? And so this sense that, Athens, of course, being representative of worldly philosophy in Jerusalem, of divine wisdom or something. And so this has been taken to mean that earthly knowledge or man's philosophy is at odds with or irreconcilable with the revealed truth of the scriptures. But then again, is this even the point that Tertullian is making in the original context? Can you speak about that just for a moment?
Absolutely. I was a guest lecturer at a college up in Minnesota. I had been several years in a row going up doing these kind of like short modules up there. And I, like everyone else before me that I knew, which is where I got it, always brought up the Tertullian quote as an example of someone who wants to drive this wedge between philosophy and theology where they don't really meet. Their oil and water. Right. And I just gave it as an example, just like everybody would do and still do perhaps. And a student, so we're talking a college-bound high school student. I think they were first year, the equivalent of first year. It was like a gap program, sort of. He came up to me during break. He said, I think that Tertullian quote is out of context. I said, really? He said, I wrote a paper on it, or I've been doing research on it and stuff. So I started chasing that down, and I think the student was right. David Lindbergh, I think, is the writer. I have it in a cheat sheet that here in front of me, so I'll maybe scroll down to see if I can find it. But David Lindbergh has an article on this very issue about Tertullian, and the point was this: what Tertullian is condemning there, what is Athens to do with Jerusalem, was really what he and perhaps we would characterize as bad philosophy, not philosophy as such. And it should be a clue that he couldn't mean philosophy of such, because if you read Tertullian a little more widely, he uses philosophy to make some of his very arguments, right? So he was very immersed in philosophical training and stuff. So he wouldn't have been able to consistently repudiate philosophy as a whole, and at the same time appeal to the tools and methods and such of philosophy to make some of his criticisms of other philosophers. So I think I don't use it that way anymore, except maybe to make that point.
Right.
That it is in fact kind of in out of context and stuff. And I'm not a Tertullian scholar, but Lindbergh's article, it comes out of a book, if memory's serving me, called "When Science and Christianity Meet," and it's a series of articles on. It's kind of like the Ronald Numbers. In fact, I think he's got some articles in this book. I thought maybe I had it here, and as you're doing, I may be able to find it. But at any rate, I think you're right that the Tertullian quote's just not, it doesn't really serve.
Right.
So if you want a good quote, you need John MacArthur. Say he's going to give you, Christ, Jesus, philosophy versus Christ kind of sentiment. And there is that sentiment that it has not only doesn't have anything to do with the Christian life, but it's antithetical to the Christian life. Ken Ham is another, though he may not necessarily frame it as a philosophy, but he more on the natural sciences. It's man's word versus God's word, kind of thing. Secular versus biblical. And you go, well, but a lot of things about God himself are knowable by the natural world. That's what Romans says. That's what Psalm 19 tells us, that Psalm 94, Acts, Psalm 106, I think it is. Also Acts 14. We've already mentioned Romans 1. We can say Romans 2 too for the morality. Lots of places where the scriptures point to the fact that what we know about God to some extent is knowable by means of the things that he made. I was reminded that if I use the example of OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. If you had let's say, workplace accident, someone falls off a scaffolding and gets injured, and they fall under the jurisdiction of OSHA regulations, right, to enforce safe workplace safety. So the OSHA guys show up with their clipboard, and they're going, okay, so why did this guy fall off the scaffolding? The answer they're not looking for is gravity, right? If the warehouse foreman said, oh, it's gravity, that's what made him fall, OSHA wouldn't go, oh, gravity, okay, and then click the gravity box, check it, and then go on. They're not asking, why do things fall? Right? They're asking, why did the gravity prevail in this situation? Were the safety harnesses not in place? Were they worn out? Was he not trained how to use them? Whatever it is. So by parallel, when we talk about good philosophy, bad philosophy, these kind of things, as we've been celebrating here, and if I had to ask an audience, well, what creates the Richard Dawkins of the world? How could you have someone who's a brilliant scientist and just misses what's right in front of him about the creation pointing to its maker? How did that happen? The answer we're not looking for is, well, it's sin. Yeah, of course it's sin.
Right.
Sin answers the question the way gravity answered the question about the guy falling off the scaffolding.
Right.
But just as OSHA's not asking, why do people fall as the sort of global issue of because the world is fallen. I mean, that, no pun intended, but it's sinful. So why do people fall because of gravity? Why do Richard Dawkins have unbelief because of sin? That's true. But we're asking, why did he, what are the ingredients that lead to someone having these points of view? And so just as the safety harness and the training and all are part of the answer to why the guy fell, I think to an important extent, and I know you think as well, philosophy, more narrowly, bad philosophy, is part of the answer to what creates the Richard Dawkins of the world. Where do these kind of intellectuals come from? There's a story there that you can identify, especially since the 16th century in Western philosophy, of a cascade of influences like Descartes, we've already mentioned. And we see what happens in both the empiricists and the rationalist tradition, culminating in the skepticism of Hume, only have Kant to come along to give a cure that's worse than the disease. You can point out these things and try to do it. It's self-serving because it just reinforces the fact that though we're not the only voice at the table, a good philosopher needs to be one of the pieces of the conversation in order to really steer the ship that we're all on.
Right.
I think.
Right. Great. Great. Just in closing, because I know I've kept you a good amount of time
Oh,
here.
it's been fun, man.
Oh
Thank you.
yeah, yeah, and we just got the toe in the water. Um, there are many different arguments for the existence of God, and you know, him being an uncaused cause, and then him having these attributes, and we're able to reason, as you've indicated, from the things that are to him, as you've quoted from the scriptures. I do realize that this is almost a complex question, uh,
Okay.
and I don't mean in terms of it's complicated. I mean in terms of there's certain assumptions in it. If you out of your tool belt could only bring out one argument for the existence of God, like you just really only could. I do understand it's somewhat circumstantial.
Yeah,
What's the
it
person
is.
dealing with? But if there was only one that you could just pull out at any moment, what would that be and why?
I think it would probably be one of the arguments, like, say, the argument from the fact that the universe hasn't always existed, but that the sciences tell us that it began to exist a finite time ago, sometimes referred to as the Big Bang. And
Right.
the reason I do that, two things are relevant to it real quickly. One, um, most people already have enough background knowledge to understand what the scientists are saying, even if they're not trained scientists, as I'm not a trained scientist. We all can understand the fact that the Big Bang and other things we could point out, but that especially shows that the universe is a consensus among physicists, astrophysicists, the universe hasn't always existed. It's not eternal. So that's got a lot of oomph to it because, well, it's the scientists that say it.
Right.
They have such social clout. Plus the fact that it's changing, but it has been for, I think, much of my life, that if you could convince somebody that the universe came into existence a finite time ago, so there must have been some cause, I think overwhelmingly people would go, well, that sounds like God to me. I mean, who else is in the business of making universes? All right. So you didn't have to do much more for them to conclude what you want them to conclude. It's going to be the God of that Western Christianity is touted because we're all in this swimming in this, 2,400 years of the development of Western. So you got a lot of things going for you. The
Right.
problem, though, is you do run into the Dawkins. Well, who made the maker, or who
Right.
created the creator, or who designed the designer, however he want to phrase
Right.
it.
Right.
So here's how I think it boils down to, because you rightly point out it depends on the circumstances, and this is kind of my guiding principle. If you do the scientific kind of premises and then conclude God exists, it doesn't in and of itself give you the attributes of God. Doesn't
Right.
show whether he's good or bad. Doesn't show whether he still exists. Doesn't show there's one or many. Doesn't show a lot of things. But again, you might not need to do that because most people would already assume if it's a universe maker, it's got to be God. Okay. So, but if you ever run into a Richard Dawkins, when you use that argument, and he starts asking, well, who designed designer? Then downstream, you'd have to start doing the quote heavy lifting to
Right.
defend the attributes of God, that there's only one, that he's good, that he's always existed, that he's time and stuff. That's all downstream if you need it. If you do the more philosophical arguments, like, say, Aquinas would give in his De Ente et Essentia, his On Being and Essence work, the essence, existence, distinction argument, or how that's woven through his 5 ways in the Summa Theologia. If you do that argument, the problem there is it's built on so many philosophical doctrines that are not that widespread known, certainly in the general public, of act and potency, form and matter, substance and accidents, essence, existence, all of these kinds of things that by the time you backfill so that you can give the argument, you've already lost the opportunity. But if
Right.
you ever did have that opportunity, with that metaphysics in place of Aquinas, you give the argument, then everything else follows inexorably. All the
Right.
attributes cascade inexorably
Mm.
from that. So it's a matter of what opportunity, it's a matter of whether the opportunity affords you to be able to backfill at the front end and then work's all done, or just assume what most
Right.
people already know as a background knowledge, like the contemporary sciences, and then
Right.
take your chances as whether you'll have to fill it up downstream to answer the attributes of God thing. That's sort of a judgment call, and you could do both. I generally would probably appeal to one of these. Hey, we can prove not only scientifically but mathematically the universe hasn't always existed, so it must have come into existence from something else. And that's the easiest thing to get the conversation going. And then if somebody is, say, philosophically trained, or they've been polluted by scientism, so they can't think beyond material causality or efficient material causality, then you can start trying to massage the conversation and start importing some Aristotle into it. And then when the time comes, you get you get Aquinas in it, and you're ready to do it. So, but I like the universe began to exist a finite time ago argument. I think is practically powerful.
Right. You mentioned the Big Bang. Do you believe that the notion of an existence, and from my exposure to some of Stephen Meyer's work, that nomenclature, the Big Bang, initially was a pejorative. It was it wasn't complimentary under any circumstance.
No, it wasn't. No, that's exactly right. There's a lot of monikers are that way. They're always given by the detractors, and then it sticks.
Right.
Yeah.
And can you affirm that the Big Bang is not inconsistent with what the scriptures describe?
So I like this question because I take a license given me by Paul Davis, the astrophysicist from I think he's in the UK. He may be in the US now, but I think he was. But anyway, wherever he is. And he's making the point about the physics, the astrophysics seems to point to the fact the universe began a finite time ago. And he's calling it the Big Bang. He's making that point. And he has this caveat, not really a caveat, but this loophole. I'll call it maybe a loophole. He says, whether we accept all the details or not, the essential thesis that the universe began a finite time ago seems to be have demonstrated. So I take that, whether one takes all the details or not, because I know that most young Earth creationists, now you didn't ask it particularly with reference to young Earth,
right.
It could impact either a young or an old Earth, which are both creationisms, and they're neither of which are theistic evolution, which some young Earth creationists want to link old Earth creationism with theistic evolution, and that's not fair, I don't think. But at any rate, when the Davis gives me that loophole, that's because a lot of young Earth creationists, in my experience, point out, perhaps rightly so, that a lot of the details about the Big Bang Theory and what it goes on to say about the universe wouldn't seem to comport, at least with the young Earth creationism. As far as I know, and now I'm doing the thing that I warned others not to do, and that's venturing into areas that are not mine. But the little that I do know, I don't think the Big Bang entails too many things that would be inconsistent with Genesis. In fact, I would go so far as to say, I'm willing to admit probably the prevailing science of the day does point to an old Earth, and it does point to, in some respects, an evolutionary history of the Earth, both of which I think are I'm sorry, did I say young Earth? Old Earth. Sorry, I said that wrong. The prevailing science of the day does point to an ancient universe, 13.7 billion years or whatever. What's a billion years among friends, right? And perhaps even evolution. In fact, I was at a meeting of old Earth creationists, basically, and one guy twirled around on his seat during a Q&A, and I'm standing at the back. I'm not the speaker. And he says, so what do you do with all the evidence that seems to point to the fact that the universe is old? And perhaps uncharitably, I shot back pretty much the same thing you do with all the evidence that seems to point to a common ancestor, which I knew he didn't hold a common ancestor. No biblical creationist would hold that all life forms came from a single. We know from the Genesis account they're separate creations.
Right.
So that's probably even easier to debate with the scientists, the origins of human versus, but I don't know. That's why I can't referee that debate. But that's all just to say, I'm not shy to admit maybe the science does point to these things that I think are false. because of my understanding of the Bible. I will remind people, however, that it wasn't too many, less than 2 centuries ago, that all of the science pointed to an eternal universe.
Right.
Well, what did the Christians do when all the scientists were saying the universe was eternal? It seemed pretty clear that Genesis was saying that it isn't, in other places.
Right.
So what did they do? They just had to knuckle under, go, I just believe what I think the Bible's teaching. I just believe that. And I'm going to stand on that hill and let the chips fall where they may. If you want to keep me out of your academic institution because I don't sign on, then so be it, which is what happens if you're not an evolutionist.
Right.
It's the movie Exposed.
Right.
People that aren't buying into the status quo and the doctrine, the orthodoxy, get ostracized.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't bother me. I'm comfortable in not being a scientist and not being an Old Testament scholar, for that matter.
Right.
I let Tom Howe referee the days of the Genesis, which he takes to be 24-hour days.
Okay.
And I'll let Stephen Meyer and John Lennox and some of these guys, or even for that matter, Jason Lyle. We had a great debate at the seminary in 2013 between Jason Lyle and Hugh Ross, 2 Christians that both affirm the inerrancy of the Bible, and at least self-identify. Now, Jason would say that Hugh doesn't hold the inerrancy of the Bible, but we've already covered that territory. So anyway, I'm thinking about starting a podcast, More Than You Wanted to Know, because I find myself, somebody goes, well, what do you think about lunch? And then a half an hour later, they go,
That's
thankfully, this is being recorded, and your audience knows you go back and do post-production to really clean up a lot of stuff. So you and I both know there may be some things that I said that we go, yeah, probably going to cut that out. Maybe
That's okay. That's okay.
We'll get rid of some of that stuff.
That's okay.
I hope this content has brought incredible value to you. Again, if you feel it has brought value to you, please subscribe to this podcast, like or follow our social media accounts and posts, share this with your friends and family. Please be sure also to visit TimotheusAcademy.com for links to more content. And as always, I hope to see you again soon at Timotheus Academy.